Okay, Ryan, thank you so much for that kind introduction and for the opportunity to be a part of this year's Vermont Humanities Winter Series. I think it's a wonderful idea to bring conversations about the humanities into our homes during these long winter evenings, and there have been plenty of long winter evenings in Buffalo, where I'm from. Thanks to all of you for joining me this evening, and I look forward to our conversation after the presentation. Your invitation has given me the chance to revisit my book, American Niceness, A Cultural History, that I completed in 2016. And the question I've been asking myself while preparing for tonight's talk is, what does it mean to talk about American niceness today versus 10 years ago? My book was published in August 2017, 6 months after Donald Trump was sworn in as the 45th president. And the book begins with him as the archetype of the ugly American. Bombastic, egocentric, and a show-off, Trump was and continues to be a walking cliche. And yet, oh, there we go. And yet, if you remember, during his first campaign, he frequently invoked the language of niceness. He criticized the New York Times in a barrage of tweets for being not nice, while describing himself as a nice guy. He added that he doesn't plan to be nasty to anybody, while railing against women, planning his Muslim ban, and ridiculing a disabled journalist at one of his rallies. Now, 10 years later, Trump 2.0 has largely abandoned the rhetoric of niceness. The pretense is gone, the attempt at likability is over, and the gloves have come off. Although Trump has removed his mask, we now have mass paramilitary gangs abducting non-citizens and citizens alike. Even 5-year-old Liam Ramos, wearing his blue bunny hat and his Spider-Man backpack, was plucked off the streets of Minneapolis and sent to a detention center in Dilley, Texas. Although Ramos and his father are now back home in Minnesota, the DOJ continues to pursue ways to deport the family back to Ecuador. Citizens are not safe either. A Latina mother in Minneapolis sends her 2 daughters to school with their U.S. passports and plastic lanyards around their necks. The youngest complains that she hates wearing it. A 75-year-old Asian immigrant, a retired mental health counselor, tapes his U.S. passport and its driver's license to his clothes whenever he leaves home. And while protecting their neighbors, Renee Nicole Good and Alex Preddy were murdered at point-blank range. It seems profoundly counterintuitive to revisit the concept of American niceness when cruelty is all around us. But I want to suggest that niceness has always existed in the context of violence. In a nation founded on the twin traumas of slavery and indigenous genocide, niceness emerged as a way to ameliorate such brutality, to sweep it under the rug, and to disassociate Americanists with aggression. The concept of niceness kept Americans innocent, free from having to acknowledge the reality of the suffering of others. The lawyer and writer Henry Dwight Sedgwick epitomized this sensibility when he described the new American type in 1908 as possessing the usual American amiability, domestic kindliness, and aversion to cruel sights and cruel sounds. As the opposite of the ugly American, the nice American embraced amiability and rejected cruelty, violence, and negative emotions. But what Sedgwick described as a new American type was not particularly new. A generation earlier, the American travel writer and actress Kate Field associated American amiability with a democratic spirit. To try to please everybody is democratic. To be indifferent to everybody is aristocratic. Consequently, Americans, men and women, are the best bred people in the world. Defined against old world snobbery, the nice American personifies a democratic sensibility, a type of person whose earnest and informal disposition is a refreshing alternative to European stuffiness. Yet Fields' words exude a tone of hubris. Americans are not just nice, but their niceness is a sign of their exceptionalism. Americans are, after all, the best bred people in the world. The rhetoric of American niceness is both comparative and competitive. It represents a paradoxical form of democratic arrogance, where Americans are not just friendly, but superior in their friendliness. Walt Whitman provides a variation of this theme when he claims that Americans are not only good-hearted, but the peaceablest and most good-hearted race in the world. Yet it is important to point out, especially since I'm speaking from Buffalo, a stone's throw away from Canada, that the US doesn't have a monopoly on niceness. Canadians have also claimed niceness as a distinguishing trait of what it means to be Canadian. Here's an ad for Root Sportswear to find the nicest Canadian as part of Canada's 150th birthday celebration in 2017. The advertising copy reads, "During the past 150 years, we have shown the world what it means to be nice through our bravery, strength, pride, and confidence." A more recent example shows how Canadian niceness offers a poignant critique of its North American counterpart. In the Canadian satirical weekly series, This Hour Has 22 Minutes, comedian Trent McKellen dresses up as a nice agent, NICE, and he is filmed greeting actual American tourists disembarking from a cruise ship at the port of Halifax, Nova Scotia, where ICE agents monitor border crossings through intimidation and fear. Trent, the nice agent, demands to see their phones only to be shown photos of grandchildren. So he welcomes the traveling Americans and offers candy, hugs, and food recommendations. And some of you may have already seen this, but I'm going to play. It's a short clip.
It's a beautiful day, and I'm here on the Halifax Boardwalk to take care of some foreigners. And that boat's full of them. I'm Trent McClellan, nice agent. You're going to need to see your phones. Let's see what's in them. Let's go.
Right.
Let's go. Unlock your phone there for me, please.
Looks
Thanks,
like
sir.
every other phone.
Let's go.
Sure.
Let's go, sir.
Look at that.
Oh my God!
That's my grandbaby.
That's your grandbaby. How
Yes.
old? Okay, now we're doing a selfie. All right, okay. Go this way. We got the buses here. We got a big day lined up for you. Probably go to Peggy's Cove, maybe a lobster boil. So let's go. Where are you guys visiting from?
Atlanta.
Virginia.
Pennsylvania. Montana.
30 minutes from D.C.
What's DC stand for?
Washington.
This man thinks DC stands for Washington. Yeah, that's a nice backpack, pal. That is really nice. Super nice. Do you have any narcotics on you? Any kind of drugs?
Let me see. No.
If you need some, you just go down right here. There's a great cannabis store down here. Got some really sweet, strong stuff. That's what I'm on right now. So that's what,
Okay, I know you're on something.
First thing you got to say is, I love the Toronto Blue Jays. So you are officially an honorary Canadian. Let's get your passport photo. Here we go. No smiling in the photo. You can't smile in a passport photo. Now we're going to mail this to you. How big is your mailbox? We got you a certified nice American card, so you can carry that around. I mean, if you have any difficulty here on the boardwalk, you simply show them that card and you're all taken care of. All right, let's get your hands where I can see them, sir. Let's go. Here's some candy.
Thank you, sir.
There you go, some candy. Candy always makes the day a little bit nicer. Redeem this coupon for one nice hug from a nice agent. Bring it in, bud. Bring it in.
Thank you.
Welcome to Canada.
Nice, isn't that nice?
Would you live in Canada full time, do you think?
That's my goal.
We got one. Yeah, he just admitted to it. All right, well, let's all go for a beaver tail together.
Okay.
You're gonna love it. Up here in Canada, we know ice is always cold, but nice never gets old. I'm Trent McClellan, nice agent, teaching foreigners a lesson, that there's still nice people in the world. It's a beautiful day, and I'm here on the Halifax board.
There we go. Oh, let me go back in time. Let me just go back one if I can. Oh, it's not letting me. That's fine. So this hilarious episode, which has gone viral in the US as well as in Canada, uses Canadian niceness not to extol Canadian exceptionalism, but to critique the authoritarian climate just south of the border by teaching foreigners, i.e. Americans, a lesson that there are still nice people in the world. But where Canadian niceness traditionally emphasizes politeness and civility, American niceness is less about mastering the rules of civility and more about being well-meaning, yet still rough around the edges. Robert Louis Stevenson called this combination the uncivil kindness of Americans, which he described as their most bewildering trait. While riding on a train, an immigrant train to California with a severe fever, Stevenson recalls how a newsboy roughly pushed his foot aside while he was laying across several seats. And Stevenson was shocked by the boy's rudeness and expected a fight to ensue. Suddenly, the boy tapped Stevenson on the shoulder and handed him a ripe pear. He then pampered Stevenson for the rest of the day, offering him newspapers to read, and tried cheering him up. American niceness was not just articulated by Americans, but as Stevenson's anecdote illustrates, it was also registered and discussed by international travelers. In the 1830s, Alexis de Tocqueville was among the first to observe that Americans represent a distinct type, a type that is selfish yet sympathetic, self-absorbed but compassionate. Their friendliness, he added, made them an ally of the French against the unfriendly disposition of the English. 50 years later, Rudyard Kipling would conclude after his visit to the US in 1889, "It is perfectly impossible to go to war with these people. Whatever they may do, they are much too nice." And this perception has continued into the 21st century, with the British writer Jeff Dyer writing in the New York Times in 2009, the first year of the Obama presidency, that Americans are not just friendly and polite, they are also charming. And the most charming thing of all is that it rarely looks like charm. American niceness, I argue, has figured in a national fantasy of American exceptionalism, but based not on military might and economic prowess, but on more banal attributes such as friendliness. The distinctiveness of Americans has been largely shaped by sociality and the importance of likability. Americans are unique because we are nice and friendly. And part of the reason I decided to start researching the concept of niceness was because its pervasiveness made it commonplace. It appears to be bankrupt of meaning and especially of any political significance. The word nice also has a distinct connection to Americanness in ways that synonyms such as amiable and friendly do not necessarily have. As Marilyn Monroe noted in 1962 in what would be her last interview, she said, "I was brought up differently from the average American child because the average child is brought up expecting to be happy. Have a nice day, as one might say." Such an expression as Monroe suggests is utterly cliched, but it is also implicated in a class and racial culture combined with the effective mandate of cheerfulness that became representative of Americanness. During the same period, the French philosopher Simone de Beauvoir, in her travelogue of the US, described this cheerfulness in terms of the propaganda of the smile. Whether it is cheerfulness or a smile, niceness is expressed through obvious and superficial gestures that are seemingly not worthy of serious inquiry. Its banality puts it under the radar of cultural analysis. My fundamental claim is that even though it often goes unnamed as a pattern of behavior, niceness pervades the everyday conduct, assumptions, and discourse of and about Americans. I argue that the origin story of American niceness begins with the encounter between the Pilgrims and the Native Americans at Plymouth, Massachusetts. The scene, which was only briefly mentioned in the actual Puritan accounts of 1621, has become mythologized in the US imaginary, largely thanks to historians in the 19th century. As you can see from this painting here in the Capitol Rotunda today from 1857. It's the foundation. The Plymouth Rock and the Plymouth Encounter is the foundation of our holiday of Thanksgiving, which began as a New England regional holiday and was made a national one by Lincoln during the Civil War. And I want to revisit this encounter narrative as a contested ground for competing versions of American niceness, whose legacy continues today. So the primal scene of American niceness occurred on March 16, 1621, 3 months after the Pilgrims arrived at Patuxent, later to be called Plymouth, when an Abenaki named Samoset greeted the strangers in English with the phrase, "Welcome, Englishmen." It was the first time that the Pilgrims had directly encountered a Native American, and they were surprised at being greeted in a friendly manner in their own language. Samoset had acquired limited English through his connections with the English fishing camp on Mohegan Island off the coast of Maine that John Smith of Pocahontas fame had set up in 1614. The desperate Puritan separatists, concerned about their own survival and safety since nearly half of their group had died, were anxious to establish friendly relations with the natives, and they showered Samoset with gifts and invited him to return with his friends. The next day, Samoset appeared with 4 companions, including Desquantum, better known as Squanto, who spoke fluent English, had traversed the Atlantic multiple times, initially as a captive, and lived in Spain, England, and Newfoundland. They brought with them skins for trade, and they entertained the colonists with singing and dancing. They soon returned with their chief sachem, Massasoit, who appeared with 60 warriors on what became known as Watson's Hill. By the end of the meeting, the Puritans and the Wampanoags had exchanged several gifts and had signed a treaty that would last for 50 years until the death of Massasoit. This snapshot of the first Pilgrim-Indian encounter marks the point of national origins. It represents the foundational story of the world's first settler colonial nation, a tale of near tragedy turned into one of triumph, with the Pilgrim's salvation leading to the Indians' demise. The nice Indian features prominently in this origin story, a story that was reiterated in national and local histories throughout the 19th century. The origins of the nation lie in Samoset's friendly salutation of welcome, and Tisquantum's teaching the Pilgrims how to grow corn and catch eel, and in Massasoit's providing protection against other tribes who wanted to annihilate the vulnerable colony. The nation, in other words, is founded on Indian giving in the literal rather than the pejorative sense. This acknowledgement of Native American hospitality yielded 2 competing versions of American niceness. The dominant version, where Native American hospitality enabled Puritan settlement and expansion, which ultimately led to the founding of the nation. The second version represents a counter-tradition of American niceness, one in which Native American hospitality is highlighted based on Native traditions of welcoming the stranger into their home, only to be betrayed by those strangers. So in the dominant version, Native hospitality becomes fused into American hospitality more generally, while the counter tradition tells a very different story of Native hospitality betrayed. So I'm going to tease out both of those versions. The dominant tradition of American niceness is given a crystal clear visual form in Jean-Léon Jerome Ferris's painting, The First Thanksgiving at Plymouth, 1621. Ferris was a popular American historical genre painter, or what was referred to at the time as a painter historian. This painting appeared on the cover of Literary Digest Thanksgiving issue in November 1928. It marks one of the first major illustrations of Thanksgiving as a native pilgrim encounter. And some of you may already know this, but in the 19th century, Thanksgiving was just depictions of snow scenes in New England. Native Americans did not figure in it. So this is why this painting is so significant. Commissioned during the First World War, Ferris's painting portrays an interracial harmony and intercultural feasting, incorporating Indian hospitality into a national version of American niceness. Ferris, however, memorializes this iconic meal by inverting its foundational power dynamics. He turns the Indians into the guests and the Puritans into the hosts, the ones who possess the food. What is most significant about the painting is that its central figure is a white hostess giving food to Native American men. This figure both feminizes and removes tension from the colonial encounter by presenting white American womanhood as the mediating figure between Anglo and Native men. Puritan accounts of the first Thanksgiving refer to Massasoit arriving with 90 warriors who brought 5 deer after a successful hunt, and natives outnumbered Puritans 2-1. Ferris's portrayal of this first feat shows the Indians receiving the Pilgrims' food, not the other way around, By portraying the Pilgrims as the givers and not the receivers, the painting affirms white sovereignty, independence, and self-sufficiency. The Pilgrims, who are the majority population in this painting, but not in reality, represent abundance, the people of plenty, generously giving food to the poor Indians, whose inferior position is reinforced spatially by the fact that they are sitting while the white men stand. And my students pointed out how Miles Standish there, the redhead in the foreground, has a sword, and there's another Puritan in the background, almost diagonally across from him with a gun. So imagine another version of this painting where Native Americans would be standing and offering food to the Puritans who would be sitting. What would such an inversion imply? To show a Native American giving food to the Puritans would be a far more accurate portrayal of the intercultural dynamics of 1621. But it would acknowledge something that Ferris's painting actively disavows, namely Anglo dependency on Indian generosity. Instead, Thanksgiving here is portrayed as Indian gratitude for white generosity, playing into a colonial fantasy of cultural inheritance that legitimates Anglo possession of the land. In contrast to this dominant account, I want to turn to the origins of the countervailing tradition of American niceness, which began 15 years after Samoset greeted the Puritans with welcome Englishmen. The second starting point begins with Roger Williams and his family when they were banished from the Massachusetts Bay Colony and were greeted with a warm welcome by the Narragansett in what would become Providence, Rhode Island. According to legend, the Narragansett greeted Roger Williams with the expression, "What cheer, Natop?" This saying combines Narragansett with English. Natop is the Narragansett word for friend, and what cheer was short for the English greeting of the day. What cheery news do you bring today? It's the 17th century equivalent of "What's up, friend?" So this bilingual expression is now emblazoned on the seal of the city of Providence. And that's the rock, I suppose, the part of the slate rock that Roger Williams arrived on. So given this warm greeting, it is not surprising that the word for welcome in Narragansett is Wunagan. And it should feature so prominently in Roger Williams' Narragansett phrase book, a key to the language of America, which was published in 1643. The term reflects a general sense of civility and courtesy, according to Williams, as it describes a whole way of life based on the daily rhythms of sociability and hospitality. According to the scholar Scott Pratt, Wunagan reflects a willingness to share one's resources, ideas, time, and affection. Williams understood this practice of welcoming to be a distinct feature of Native culture. In other words, it's not just a word that can be translated as welcome, but represents a whole way of life. Williams writes, "They, the Narragansett, are remarkably free and courteous to invite all strangers in, and if any come to them upon any occasion, they request them to come in." And then he adds that he has seen far more kindness among the natives than he has witnessed among thousands that call themselves Christians. Although Williams considered himself a friend of the natives, and he was among the few early English settlers who studied Narragansett and acknowledged the importance of indigenous practices of welcoming, or Wunagan, he nonetheless became invested in the English colonial project, participating and profiting from the sale of native lands. So I don't want to idealize Williams too much here. Nevertheless, Williams' recognition of Wunagan is the starting point of a counter tradition of American niceness, one that understands nation building as the betrayal of Native American hospitality. This counter tradition took the form in the 19th century among Native American orators as well as white and Black allies. And the common refrain goes something like this: Native Americans generously helped the first settlers to survive, and when the settlers acquired the necessary skills, they betrayed their generous hosts and took their land. In this version, indigenous dispossession is understood as the betrayal of Native American hospitality. This counter-tradition brings to the fore the ambiguity of hospitality embedded in the very Latin root of the word, which is hostis. This is the same root word for hostility, reminding us that there is something fundamentally risky about hospitality. It's fascinating that they share the same root. Hospitality can cultivate fellow feeling as well as hostility, which is to say that the guest may become a trusted friend or the one who betrays you. The Oglala Sioux leader, Black Elk, who survived the Battle of Little Bighorn in 1876 and the Wounded Knee Massacre in 1890, understood Native American kindness as our mistake. He blamed Native Americans for being too loving and too trusting, while underestimating the white settlers' capacity for cruelty. I'm going to quote him here. The first thing an Indian learns is to love each other, and that they should be relative like to the four-leggeds. The next thing is telling the truth. Whatever they say, they stand by it. Here's where the Indians made their mistake. We should treat all our fellow men alike. The Great Spirit made men alike. Therefore, we made a mistake when we tried to get along with the whites. We tried to love them as we did ourselves. On account of this, we are now in misery. For Black Elk, Indian niceness failed to humanize the settlers, to incorporate them within indigenous forms of sociality. Black Elk's rebuke blames Indian loving in part for Indian destruction. We tried to love them as we did ourselves, highlighting how hospitality is an exercise in vulnerability, a fundamental openness to the other. Vulnerability lies at the heart of Indian hospitality, an openness that exposed Native Americans to settler colonial violence. Black abolitionists writing both gratefully acknowledges Indian hospitality while also using it to rebuke the ruthlessness of white America. In a speech delivered in 1850 in Rochester, New York, Frederick Douglass exclaimed, "The slave finds more of the milk of human kindness in the bosom of the savage Indian than in the heart of his Christian master. He leaves the man of the Bible and takes refuge with the man of the tomahawk." Here, Douglass rejects the stereotype of the savage Indian and praises Indian kindness as more in the spirit of Christianity than the slave master who carries a Bible in one hand while whipping his slave with the other. If the dominant version of niceness disavows violence to facilitate national forgetting, the alternative version acknowledges the link between niceness and violence. In doing so, this version of American niceness constitutes a national reckoning with the twin traumas of enslavement and indigenous genocide, a form of reckoning that acknowledges the suffering of others. Without this humbler and more reflective version of American niceness that interrogates bigotry rather than reproducing it, we risk becoming, to quote James Baldwin, moral monsters. These alternative forms of niceness emerged in part in the 19th century to protest the Trail of Tears and the forced displacement of tens of thousands of Native Americans. Let me finish that sentence. And tens of thousands of Native Americans. American writers such as Washington Irving and Helen Hunt Jackson acknowledged the long legacy of white settler violence against indigenous communities. Infuriated at these human rights abuses, Washington Irving demanded that white America blush with shame at their ongoing legacy of Indian hating. Later in the century, Helen Hunt Jackson, who was old friends with Emily Dickinson, documented the ethnic cleansing of Native Americans through forced removal, massacres, broken treaties, disease, and hunger. Entitled A Century of Dishonor, which was published in 1881, Jackson sent a red leather-bound copy to every member of the 47th Congress, embossed with the words, "Look upon your hands. They are stained with the blood of your relations." I couldn't find that particular edition, but I did find this first edition. When I saw the photograph of the protesters at the congressional hearing of then Secretary of State Anthony Blinken in October 2023, holding up their hands painted in red, demanding a ceasefire in Gaza, I couldn't help but to be reminded of Helen Hunt Jackson's anti-colonial activism of the late 19th century. This counter tradition of American niceness is as foundational as its more well-known version. And I want to conclude with another native, non-native encounter, and this one took place during the Standing Rock protests against the Dakota Access Pipeline. In the first week of December 2016, nearly 2,000 U.S. military veterans came from across the U.S. to support the water protectors at Standing Rock from increasingly aggressive Dakota Access Pipeline security guards. On December 5th, 2016, tribal leaders gathered, including the Lakota spiritual leader, Leonard Crow Dog, who thanked the crowd for their support. He then invited whoever wanted to speak. At that point, former U.S. Army officer Lieutenant Wes Clark Jr., the son of General Wesley Clark, raised his hand and stood up. Dozens of veterans stood up behind Clark, and Clark took the microphone and addressed the comments directly to Chief Leonard Crow Dog. He began by saying, "We came here to be the conscience of the nation." Clark then admits that he and others behind him had fought in the same military units that had fought during the Indian Wars. I'm going to play a short clip of this forgiveness ceremony.
We came here to be the conscience of the nation, and in that conscience, we must first confess our sins to you, because many of us, me particularly, are from the units that have hurt you over the many years. We came, we fought you, we took your land, we signed treaties that we broke, we stole minerals from your sacred hills, we blasted the faces of our presidents onto your sacred mountain, and we took still more land, and then we took your children, and then we tried to take your language, and we tried to eliminate your language that God gave you and that the Creator gave you. We didn't respect you. We polluted your earth. We've hurt you in so many ways. And we've come to say that we are sorry. We are at your service, and we beg for your forgiveness. Conscience.
Wes Clark Jr.'s apology was based on historical reckoning. It's an incredibly moving scene. I only saw Democracy Now! Covering it when it happened, and not the mainstream media, unfortunately. And Wesley Clark Jr. made sure that he was wearing the blue hat and jacket of the 7th Cavalry, the same cavalry led by Lieutenant Colonel George Custer in the Battle of Little Bighorn in 1876. The Lakota and Cheyenne defeated the U.S. Army in what became known as Custer's Last Stand, where Custer and 2 of his brothers were killed. To wear this Army uniform and to kneel before the Lakota elders is a powerful symbolic act of apology and humility that provides a corrective to Ferris's painting of the first Thanksgiving. This forgiveness ceremony represents an example of 21st century American niceness based on the counter tradition that began with Roger Williams' recognition of the Narragansett form of welcome, Wunegan. This welcoming practice was the basis of a powerful national and international movement of solidarity at Standing Rock. And as Lisa Silvestri has noted in her analysis of the ceremony, Coalition building requires leaving one's comfort zone. It literally means going outside. Earlier that day, 1,500 veterans joined arms to serve as human shields between the water protectors and the private security guards. They marched for 2 hours in freezing temperatures, blinding snow, with shards of ice, according to one journalist, piercing exposed skin. The photograph, entitled Human Shields, highlights the physical discomfort of solidarity, which complements in many ways the historic and emotional discomfort of the forgiveness ceremony, where the tears and even cries of veterans were heard in the silence after Wes Clark Jr.'s words. When I see the photograph of Human Shields today, 10 years after Standing Rock, I can't help but to see its similarity to the images we see of Minnesotans heroically protesting ice in sub-degree temperatures this winter. Winona LaDuke, the Native American writer and activist who wrote about her experience at Standing Rock in a book called To Be a Water Protector, which she published in 2020, she's recently written about the invasion of ice in her home state of Minnesota. And she asks, why is Minnesota a target when the agricultural states of Florida, Texas, and California have a much higher population of undocumented workers? For LeDuc, Minnesota has a long and proud history of social justice movements, a tradition that has created, and these are her words, a white majority state that has opened its arms to immigrants. Perhaps that's why MAGA hates us, unquote. Even rural Minnesotans in the deep north, she adds, are organizing with meetings over coffee and lemon bars. These acts of solidarity across the state suggest that a countervailing form of Minnesota nice is emerging, not the conventional form that is commonly associated with conflict avoidance and passive-aggressive behavior, but one based on courageous alliances, not unlike those from Standing Rock. With at least 4 members having been detained by ICE, the Oglala Sioux have banned ICE and Border Patrol agents from the Pine Ridge Reservation. In Minneapolis, where the American Indian movement began nearly 60 years ago, Native people performed an Ojibwe healing dance to promote unity during a memorial honoring Renee Nicole Good and Alex Pretty. This version of Minnesota Nice, which welcomes all who oppose oppression, is spreading across the country, and what we have seen is a reckoning with our history through the lens of our current reality. From Standing Rock forgiveness ceremony a decade ago to contemporary protests against ICE, we are witnessing in real time decolonized forms of unity, a form of American niceness based on the Narragansett notion of welcoming, Wunagan, in which we stand beside the stranger in solidarity. Thank you.
Thank you. If folks want to put any additional questions into the chat or into the Q&A tool at the bottom, we will make sure to present those and try to get those answered. So we have some already. There's some that are comments. There's a question here about the painting you showed of the Thanksgiving. AB wonders, are there paintings of the real history with the roles reversed than what the one you had shown?
You know, that's a great question. I haven't found one. And if you find one, please share it with me at bramen@buffalo.edu. Maybe there's more contemporary ones. That's a really wonderful question. I found this one, it became the cover of my book. It's in the Library of Congress. The painting itself is in private hands, unfortunately, but it was opened for public use. But yeah, I would love to see whether or not contemporary artists have done other renditions of the encounter, of the dinner.
And here's a question, comment from Clove in reference to the video with asking for forgiveness. They say asking for forgiveness is so strange. We abused you for centuries, and now with a few sentences we ask for more. Rather than dedicating to serving, restoring, making more right, we ask to be released from the past.
So, in other words, you're not convinced that it's enough to say, I'm sorry, given the ravages. But I think to give a generous reading to Wes Clark Jr., he kneels and said, "We are at your service, and we are allies with you in this protest against the pipeline and the private security guards." So there is this sense of alliance. We're going to fight alongside you, and they did, right? But I understand your point that is I'm sorry sufficient. What's interesting that Crow Dog says, I accept your apology. And he gives a speech, and I can share the link, or perhaps you can sort of Google the forgiveness ceremony on YouTube and see the 6 minute speech that he gives precisely. And what's interesting in that speech by Leonard Crowdog, who, if you may remember, he was an activist in AIM in the 1970s. He was arrested with Leonard Peltier and spent 2 years in Leavenworth, much of that in solitary confinement. And then he was released ultimately after serving 2 years. So he had been imprisoned by the carceral state. He has such a sort of a proud history of defiance and resistance. And what was so interesting about his speech, and I couldn't play all of it here, was he recounts all the treaties that had been broken. And for any student of 19th century history and of Native American oratory, which I teach at Buffalo, they always rehearsed the broken treaties in Native American oratory. And that's what he did in his speech in the forgiveness ceremony. All right. So there wasn't a sense of we'll forgive and forget. There's an absolute recourse to memory. And let's go back and talk about those treaties. So I understand what you're saying, that I'm sorry seems insufficient. At the same time, it's a starting point, and it's one that Leonard Crow Dog embraced. And if you saw his family member next to him, he was just crying. It was an incredibly poignant moment. And then there was also a recognition of that history of genocide through the broken treaties and the battles.
Thank you. Here's a question from Anne Lanza, who mentions that she was a student of yours in a couple of courses 10 years ago. So has a message for you there.
Wonderful. Thanks so much for joining us tonight, Anne. I appreciate it.
And Anne says, do you see American niceness as something that perpetuated racism, violence, and anti-immigration from the far right, or as something that was used as a veil for Americans to grow oppression and violence? Maybe both?
Yeah, it's absolutely both. And that's why I think it's important that I focus on the two traditions. So I could have talked about the dominant version exclusively. It was a way for Americans to disavow, to deny the history of violence, right? And to do a collective forgetting. It's how Baldwin uses innocent. Your countrymen are innocent, and he doesn't mean it as a positive. But I thought that was too easy, all right, just to sort of see it as a form of denial and a veiling of actual violence. That history is absolutely there, and it's one that I recognize in this book. But I also wanted to show how niceness has a contested history. And I wanted to include the sort of Native American narratives of betrayal into this counter tradition of here we gave you food and you betrayed us. And I think that's just as important as this dominant one, which is one is used for forgetting and the other is recovering memory. And what one Native American artist, Dylan Miner, calls long memory. So I show how they're contested, and it hasn't been resolved yet.
I'll call for any other questions that folks have. I do have one here. Um, you had the historical examples of how Americans were viewed abroad. I think this comes from something that I listened to recently on a podcast in terms of the reputation that Americans have, and in other countries and have had since the end of World War II. Part of that and maybe going back further, part of that reputation is of being people focused on niceness, and wondering about your thoughts about will that change in terms of things like our changing relationship with NATO, uh, being very acquisitive about Greenland, showing that we're perfectly willing to go into a country like Venezuela and just remove a leader from power, which of course, was done many, many times before, Dominican Republic and so on and so forth. Curious if you see that reputation might change, and then what would be the impact of that being changed, impact of that maybe from even a foreign policy, or even just Americans being able to travel abroad in the ways that we have taken for granted.
There's so many answers to that question. When I went to Britain in the 1980s during Thatcher and Reagan, it was no picnic then. And a number of Americans used to have the maple leaf on our backpacks or on baseball caps to pass as Canadian. So I think there's always been tension, right? But you're absolutely right that it's accentuated now. And on the one hand, it's refreshing that American imperial brutality is out in the open. All right, because I remember in the 80s, the US would invade Grenada, they'd invade Guatemala, El Salvador, and it would barely make the headlines. All right. And now it's out in the open. Just there isn't even, Trump doesn't even try to make a narrative about Maduro in Venezuela. At least the weapons of mass destruction that Bush created and he spun, he made the effort. Right? But here, there's not even the pretense that there's a reason other than oil. Right. So there's absolutely, the gloves are off, and US imperial might is at its most crude. All right. And it has elicited a response. And I think people are saying I distinguish the government of the US from the people, but there's still a tremendous amount of anti-Americanism, and I understand why. I mean, I live on the Canadian border. There's a lot of hostility. I was in Mexico City this summer, and there have been protests against North Americans and the cost of living and the gentrification. The largest expat population of American expats are Mexico. You would think it's in England, or Canada, but it's in Mexico. So there were absolutely anti-gringo protests in Mexico City. So there's a huge wave of anti-Americanism happening. At the same time, I think the social media has helped to show that we're not a monolith in the way that the 80s we were seen as a monolith. I remember being in an art gallery in London, and a woman came up to me and said, "I'm terrified of your government and your President Reagan." And I was in my 20s, and I said, "I'm terrified as well." But without the internet, without seeing all these contested views over here, it was very easy to create a kind of type. And I think now it's more complicated, but that doesn't mean that there's not a potent dose of anti-Americanism all around, even as close as Ontario, Canada. And you just have to sort of carry on with humility, I think. And yeah.
Yeah, thank you. That leads us to our next comment and question. Um, This is from Jack. I am struck by the physical and emotional expression of humility in the forgiveness ceremony you shared. Humbling oneself in such a manner seems at odds with the traditional vision of American niceness you've discussed, which is self-confident and domineering by nature. If we can see humility as something uniquely lacking in the American flavor of niceness, quite different, say, than the well-mannered politeness associated with other parts of the Anglosphere. And then the question, I'm curious about what you might have to say about how American humility has been represented in the historical record. For instance, in accounts of American travelers responding to different cultural norms outside of their own communities.
Oh, wow. Now I have an idea for a sequel. All right, that's really a suggestive idea. These are all great observations and questions, by the way. Um, yeah, this whole idea of American humility and travel literature abroad. I think it might be a short book, but it's certainly worth attempting. I think I teach Fire Next Time every year to my students by Baldwin. And he is saying that we need humility, right? That's the only way that the racial tensions are going to be overcome, right? And including white humility as well in that equation. And so I think that there's a tradition of saying we need to overcome this fear we have of our own history, and there has to be a reckoning. And perhaps, Trump revising history, banning certain narratives of history will encourage people to sort of dig deep and react against that sense of official forgetting. Um, but this idea of humility, I think it's a hard one. I came across the Nice American when Henry James wrote his mother. I think it was in the 1860s. He said there's a lot of new money Americans. He was quite a snob. And he said there's a lot of bragging, ugly American types. But then he wrote in a footnote to his mother, but I have met some nice Americans. And I think the nice American will always be a kind of minority, I think, within the landscape of types and all that. But they certainly existed. One of my favorite examples is Thomas Jefferson. And he wrote the Declaration of Independence, the Declaration of War. He goes to Britain 10 years later, and he doesn't understand all the anti-Americanism against him. He said, everyone in England hates us, and I don't understand it. So I think there's a wonderful history here of the sensitive American, that even the one who writes a declaration of war doesn't understand why the English hate him. And so this goes back really to the founding of the nation.
Any other questions? I see Pat has written, thank you very much for this presentation.
You're welcome. Thank you. This has been a real pleasure.
I agree. And if there aren't any other questions, I think I will bid everyone a good night and say thank you again. I feel like I learned a great deal. And oh, Zoe is working on one. Let's see what Zoe has types. Thanks for giving us a heads up before I call it.
And thank you all for coming. I appreciate it.
I am reminded I was in over in Orwell earlier and came up over the Green Mountains through a lot of snow today to come home to Barnard, and that we used to do a lot of in-person events in the winter. And anyway, this is a little easier sometimes.
Yeah, I think it's an excellent idea, especially this time of year.
Yeah, and
That's for sure.
I for one am grateful that it's become a little less chilly.
Yes.
It's just back to normal. So we'll see if Zoe has a question. If anyone else has one to either put into the chat or Q&A, we'll wait for another moment or so before we bid good night to everybody. And we did have an earlier question about recordings. This presentation we will add to our website and to our YouTube channel. Two of the previous of the four, so three of them we will make available. The one from last week, our presenter preferred that not go out onto the internet, but if you will email us at community@vermonthumanities.org, we can send you that link. So Zoe asks, I'm wondering if you see a relationship between the puritanical disconnection from land practices as driving their surprise at indigenous welcomeness.
Hmm. Driving their surprise at indigenous welcomeness. I hadn't thought about it in terms of land practices. Zoe, what were you thinking of in terms of Puritan um, disassociation or disconnection from land practices?
Hey, Zoe, I can allow you to talk here. Let's see.
Oh, I can.
Zoe might be able to talk or type. I hate to try to answer.
Are you able to hear me?
We are, yes.
Okay, I'm just joining from the browser. So thank you for giving this fantastic talk. I guess I'm just wondering about I guess lack of as far as I'm aware, lack of a dominant idea of like animism or connection to land, viewing it as like dead, pretty much, not making that relationship versus, you know, indigenous relationship, deeper relationship to land. And I'm just wondering, like, the person you had quoted as describing the term for welcomeness.
Yeah, when you get, yeah, Roger
Yeah,
Williams.
just like that surprise factor. And I'm wondering what prompted the
Yeah.
surprise.
Yeah, so that's a really interesting question because you're right. The Puritans had a very transactional understanding of the land, right? We need to master it to be able to grow crops and to be able to have a profit, right? And these were capitalist ventures, and they had to produce profit, and there was this anxiety of going into debt regarding it. And so it's not surprising that their relationship to niceness was also transactional. We'll be nice to them, to the Native Americans, in order for them to give us knowledge, but it was always seen as circumscribed, as isolated. Some of Bradford's writing, he describes how the Native Americans invite them to their homes and invite them to sleep in their blankets and all if it's too late to go back. And he's completely disgusted by that interaction, right? There's almost a repulsion to be invited in. This clear sense of Puritan boundaries, right? Even with other English, right? In the Church of England. So I think it has to do with the Puritans have a very transactional relationship to the land as well as to sociality, right? You're nice to me because I want information from you. And when they got the knowledge, they didn't have to be nice anymore. And you're right, that's radically different from the Native American view of an animus of an interconnected world, where what is Black Elk says, you befriend the four-leggeds as you would your loved ones. So there's no speciesism, there's no hierarchy of man, the chain of being. There is a kind of equivalence and the sense that we live in an animated, interconnected world. And the stranger is just a friend, right? That you don't know yet. I know that sounds corny, but that is what the welcoming ceremony is about. So it's absolutely the opposite of transactional exchange, and it's more about an investment in relationships. And Roger Williams was absolutely fascinated. He's really the first anthropologist, even before there was anthropology, in the Americas. But unfortunately, he becomes swayed by the English hunger for land and starts building his own real estate empire. And he even buys a Native American slave and names him William. So Roger Williams is not the hero, even though I do a kind of, he's a starting point for a counter tradition. He ultimately becomes seduced by the profit of the land, and he follows the English, the very people who banished him.
Thank you. Yeah, I kind of see it as like already not understanding. He already cannot understand the concept of their hospitality, or he views it solely as hospitality as like something almost domestic, but not as extending just to a fellow living being, like in that weird way. He's still viewing it through a lens. I don't know.
Although, I was listening to a fascinating podcast of the editors of Reading Roger Williams, and they said he was the first to listen to Native Americans, and he was proficient in Narragansett, and he would often have Native American leaders in his home. So, in terms of hospitality, there was always an intercultural feast in his home. But they're full of contradictions, and Roger Williams isn't alone. So he was actually probably the most familiar with the leadership of the Narragansett. At the same time, um, the call for land was too much of a driving force for him, so he betrayed a number of people as well.
I think we'll finish with this last questions because we're almost at time. But Jack says, speaking of Jefferson, was there any noticeable change in representations of American niceness before versus after the Revolution? And he is wondering if there's anything to the idea that the niceness identity was spurred on by the sense of patriotism and the need to distinguish a young U.S. Republican culture from its former colonizer.
Yes, in fact, that's my introduction. That's exactly my introduction. that the word anti-American doesn't show up until 1776. So the birth of anti-American coincides with the birth of the nation. And so American niceness is absolutely a response to that. All right. And in fact, if you look at the Declaration of Independence, Jefferson didn't want to alienate the English. They focused the critique on the king, but they didn't want to upset the English more generally. In fact, Jefferson was the reluctant revolutionary. As late as 1775, he didn't want to have a break with Britain. All right. And the original version of the Declaration is a kind of bromance of what could have been between us, and it was very wistful. Where Thomas Paine was like, we must go forward and burn the castles and the monarchy in very fiery rhetoric, which was very opposite to Jefferson. But you're right, the type of Brother Jonathan emerged as the lanky prefiguring of Uncle Sam. And he was the hated son of the English John Bull. And he came to America minding his own business, wanting to be a yeoman farmer, and John Bull kept beating him up. And he was a bully. So even then, the first type is Brother Jonathan. And he's this likable loner who he doesn't like conflict. And he was really the first national type that became Uncle Sam.